What would life really be like without Star Trek? At first, you may think no Shatner or no live long and prosper. But when you go down the rabbit hole, it turns out the show influenced day-to-day life as we know it. And the crazy thing, it was this close to never happening. On 3 separate occasions, Star Trek the original series was on life support. And had it died, the ripple effects would have been mind-blowing. Today I'm going through the insane butterfly effect of Star Trek and the miracles that saved the show and fundamentally altered the world around us. Let's start at the beginning, with the man who got the whole ball rolling, Gene Roddenberry. Roddenberry as a child loved science fiction, but at the time, it was considered pulp for kids. It wasn't taken seriously by mainstream culture. It certainly wasn't seen as a career path. So he did what many young men did. He went to war. He became a B-17 bomber pilot, flew combat missions, and after the war, was a pilot for Pan Am. In 1947, his plane crashed in Syria. The plane caught fire, and Roddenberry, injured, pulled passengers from the wreckage. 14 people died, but he saved many more. If you think about it, with Roddenberry going to war and getting in plane crashes, it's amazing Star Trek even had a shot of existing in the first place. Anyway, just 2 years later, in 1949, he did something crazy. He quit flying and joined the Los Angeles Police Department. Not because he wanted to be a cop, because he wanted to be a writer. And he figured police work would give him material, street-level drama, real human conflict, and it worked. He started selling scripts, first for Dragnet, then Naked City, then Westerns. Remember, this is the 1950s. Westerns dominated television. Roddenberry became head writer for Have Gun Will Travel for 2 years and won a Writers Guild Award. By 1963, NBC gave him his own show, The Lieutenant, a drama about Marines. It lasted only 1 season, but here's what mattered. By then, Roddenberry had proven himself. He was a professional, a guy who could deliver episodic television, and that whole time, the sci-fi bug never left him. He kept thinking about what television could be if someone took science fiction seriously, if someone used the future as a lens to examine the present, philosophy, morality, social issues, all wrapped in adventure. So in March of 1964, he sat down and drafted a treatment. He called it Star Trek, and he pitched it as Wagon Train to the Stars, because that's how you sold things in the 60s. You compared it to a hit show. Westerns were safe, Westerns made money, so Star Trek was a Western in space. Even with that clever framing, Roddenberry was facing an impossible uphill battle. You see, back in the 50s and 60s, sci-fi was nothing like Star Trek. There were shows like Captain Video and his Video Rangers, Space Patrol, and Tom Corbett, Space Cadet. They were aimed at kids, cheesy sets, cardboard rockets, good guys versus bad guys. Captain Video had a $25 per week prop budget. They couldn't afford to show space travel, so they just cut to stock footage of old Western serials and pretend the captain was watching his agents on video monitors. It was absurd. These shows were popular for a few years, but by the mid-50s, Captain Video and Space Patrol were canceled. Tom Corbett lingered in syndication until 1959, but primetime networks had abandoned space adventure. Space shows were expensive, difficult to produce, and unless they were for children, they meant failure. Really, the only sci-fi that worked were anthology shows like The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits. Morality plays with twist endings. Each episode stood alone. No spaceships, no ongoing crews, no expensive special effects every week. Now, by 1964, one network was willing to go to space again. CBS was developing Irwin Allen's Lost in Space. But Lost in Space was exactly the kind of sci-fi networks thought could work. The Swiss Family Robinson trapped in space. Kid-friendly, simple adventures, safe entertainment for families. What Roddenberry was pitching was the complete opposite. Adults making difficult moral decisions, philosophy, allegories for complex social issues. It was risky. Roddenberry needed a studio willing to take that risk. And that's where Lucille Ball enters the story. You know her from I Love Lucy, but by 62, she'd become the first woman to run a major Hollywood television studio, Desilu Productions. Her marriage to Desi Arnaz had fallen apart. She bought him out and became sole owner. And Desilu was desperate. It hadn't launched a successful new pilot in years and needed a hit to prove it could still compete. So when Roddenberry came to them in 64, they listened. Desilu had a first-look deal with CBS, but they passed immediately. They already had Lost in Space, so Desilu took it to NBC instead. Roddenberry's producer, Herb Solow, had connections there, Grant Tinker, head of NBC's West Coast programming. Tinker saw something in it. NBC commissioned a pilot called The Cage. It cost over $600,000, making it one of the most expensive pilots of its time. Desi Lu, desperate for a hit, agreed to produce it. Roddenberry cast Jeffrey Hunter as Captain Pike, a solid TV actor known for serious roles. And for the alien science officer Spock, he cast Leonard Nimoy, a working actor who'd been scraping by on B-movies and TV guest spots. NBC executives immediately panicked about Nimoy. The pointed ears, the arched eyebrows, he looked satanic. They airbrushed his ears out of promotional photos and kept telling Roddenberry to drop the Martian. Roddenberry refused. The episode was philosophical, about illusion, reality, freedom. NBC's response? Too cerebral. Translation, too smart. The audience won't get it, but NBC didn't completely reject it. They saw potential. So they did something incredibly rare. They commissioned a second pilot. At Desi Lu, board members were resistant. They just spent a fortune on a pilot that got rejected. But Lucille, as majority owner, approved the gamble. Her support made the second pilot possible. Now, this second pilot would have one huge difference, one that would change sci-fi forever. Jeffrey Hunter left after the first pilot. Some blame his wife, others say he wanted to do movies. Either way, Roddenberry needed a new captain. Enter William Shatner as James T. Kirk. Shatner was a working actor. Canadian theater, Broadway, some TV, respectable but not famous. They shot the second pilot in mid-1965 titled Where No Man Has Gone Before. NBC loved the second pilot and ordered a full season. And America was about to see one of the most diverse casts on television. Uhura, a Kenyan communications officer, Sulu, a Japanese helmsman, McCoy, an American doctor from Georgia, Scotty, a Scottish engineer, and Janice Rand, an American yeoman. It was a cast ahead of its time and a testament to both Roddenberry and NBC, which encouraged its producers to cast minorities. The Man Trap, the first episode to air, debuted on September 8, 1966. Reviews were mixed. The Philadelphia Inquirer and San Francisco Chronicle liked it. The New York Times and the Boston Globe didn't. And Variety, the industry Bible, called it an incredible and dreary mess of confusion and complexities and predicted it won't work. The premiere benefited from airing against reruns, but ratings slipped once stronger competition arrived. By season's end, Trek averaged around 52nd place nationally. Not a disaster, but marginal enough that NBC considered cancellation. It was expensive to produce. Science fiction didn't have broad appeal, but NBC's research department noticed something interesting. Star Trek had a quality audience. Upper income, better educated males, people who bought expensive products. Advertisers liked that demographic, so NBC renewed it. Barely. But then came a new threat: money. Star Trek was bleeding cash. Special effects, sets, costumes, all expensive. Desi Lu was profitable, but cash poor. So Lucille Ball sold it to Gulf and Western, and Paramount took over production. But the real near-death moment came at the end of Season 2. By late '67, ratings had declined further. NBC kept moving it around the schedule. It was getting crushed by Gomer Pyle and the CBS Friday night movie. Word leaked, NBC was canceling the show. No Season 3. And that's when two people most people have never heard of did something unprecedented. B. Jo Trimble and her husband John were sci-fi fans, convention regulars since the 50s. They had a mailing list of 4,000 names. When they heard Star Trek might get canceled, they organized. They didn't just ask fans to write letters, they told them to recruit. One person recruits 10, then those 10 recruit 10 more. Exponential growth. Letters started arriving at NBC in December '67, a few hundred a week, then thousands. By February '68, NBC was receiving thousands of letters per week. Some estimates say over 1 million total, though the reliable count is 116,000. Here's the problem: NBC had a policy of responding to every letter. They typically got 50,000 letters a year across all shows combined. The Trimbles campaign overwhelmed them, and it worked. On March 1st, '68, during the episode The Omega Glory, NBC announced Star Trek had been renewed. But that didn't mean NBC was happy to continue. They were actually furious. And that was reflected in the scheduling and production. Friday, 10 p.m. death slot, slashed budget. Season 3 was rougher, cheaper, less polished, and in June of 1969, the show was canceled. 3 seasons, 79 episodes, game over. Just another sci-fi show sucked into a black hole, never to be seen again. But then, another miracle. Because the show ran for that 3rd season, it qualified for syndication. And this is where everything changed. Local stations started picking up Star Trek, and it started building an audience. People who'd watched it sporadically now watched it every day. Stations aired it at 5 p.m., right when kids got home from school. By '72, Star Trek was airing in over 60 countries. Fan conventions started, the first one in New York. Organizers expected a few hundred people. 3,000 showed up. The next year, 6,000. And before you know it, Star Trek began to transcend television. In 1976, NASA unveiled its first shuttle prototype. Originally to be named Constitution, fans pushed for Enterprise. NASA agreed, naming the test vehicle Enterprise and inviting the cast to the rollout. By the late 70s, Paramount realized they had a phenomenon. They started developing Star Trek Phase 2, a new TV series, but then Star Wars hit in '77 and made a fortune. Paramount pivoted and turned Phase 2 into a feature film. Star Trek. The motion picture premiered in December '79 and made over $100 million. 6 more films followed, and in '87, Star Trek The Next Generation launched, becoming one of the most successful syndicated shows in television history. But here's the thing, none of that happens without Season 3. No 3rd season means no syndication. No syndication means no conventions, no influence on NASA, no cultural foothold. And with that in mind, now comes the part of the video that's equal parts mind-blowing and terrifying, the butterfly effect. In other words, what wouldn't exist as we know it if Star Trek had died in '68. Let's start with George Lucas. In 2011, Lucas gave an interview for the documentary Trek Nation. He said, "Star Trek softened up the entertainment arena so that Star Wars could come along and stand on its shoulders." There was a fan base out there, primarily the Star Trek fan base, who understood sci-fi, understood visual sci-fi, and was ready for something like this to be in the feature arena. In other words, without Star Trek making sci-fi mainstream, there's no guarantee Star Wars succeeds to the same degree. Star Wars premiered in May '77, made $770 million worldwide, spawned a franchise worth billions. It revolutionized special effects, created industrial light and magic, the gold standard for visual effects in Hollywood. Every blockbuster since owes something to Star Wars, which means they also owe something to Star Trek. But the butterfly effect goes deeper than film and television. Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple Computer, engineer of the Apple I and Apple II, said this in a HuffPost interview. "I'm not sure I would have had the inspiration that I had to ever start Apple and do all these technical things, and I don't think I would have had the meaning in my life if I hadn't gone to Star Trek conventions when I was young." In case you were wondering, the Apple II, released in '77, became one of the foundational machines of the personal computer revolution. Without Star Trek inspiring Wozniak, does this happen? But the impact goes even deeper. Countless engineers, scientists, inventors, and creators were inspired by Star Trek. Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon, said this about why he created Alexa. "Our vision was that in the long term, it would become like the Star Trek computer." He was so obsessed with the show, he begged Paramount for years to let him be in a movie. He finally got a cameo in Star Trek Beyond, as an alien. Amit Singhal, the former head of Google Search, the guy who wrote the code for the modern search engine, grew up in the Himalayas dreaming of the Star Trek computer. He said, "The destiny of Google's search engine is to become that Star Trek computer. And that's what we are building. The perfect search engine is one you can talk to, just like on the Enterprise." Martin Cooper, inventor of the cell phone, said, "When I was young, the concept of being a dreamer was a very negative one. If you were a dreamer, you were useless. You didn't contribute anything to society, but Star Trek made dreaming legitimate, and I think that was a huge contribution, and that's just scratching the surface. How many NASA engineers grew up watching Kirk and Spock and decided to work in aerospace? How many medical researchers were inspired by Dr. McCoy's tricorder and went into diagnostics? How many computer scientists saw the Enterprise's computer interface and decided to make that real? We really don't know how deep this rabbit hole goes, but here's what we do know. It's not stopping. The vision Roddenberry created of humanity exploring the stars, working together using technology to solve problems, is still inspiring the people building our future. The entrepreneurs launching rockets, the scientists developing AI, the engineers designing the next generation of technology. Star Trek didn't just change entertainment and technology, it changed what people believed was possible. And it's all because a pilot-turned-cop-turned-TV writer pitched an impossible idea, smart science fiction for adults, because Lucille Ball approved Desilu's financing of the second pilot despite board concerns, because NBC took a chance, and because two superfans organized one of the most impactful grassroots campaigns ever. We don't always know which moments matter, which decisions will ripple outward and change everything. But sometimes, if we're lucky, we get to look back and trace the thread and see how close we came to living in a completely different reality.